Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It's Katie Gibbs, Executive Director here at Evidence for Democracy. Thank you all for coming. So I'm delighted to introduce Yarmie, who's going to be giving the webinar today. We have been really excited to have him with us here at E4D for the summer as an intern. He is very experienced at science communication, and he's just finishing up his master's in science communication at Laurentian. He's been working on some amazing videos for us that we're excited to share with you over the next few weeks. And he's sort of compiled everything he's learned about scicom into a webinar for you. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jeremiah to get started.
Great, thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. So I'm Yarmie. I'll be with you for the next some odd hour, and we'll be discussing science communication, sort of from an introductory, cursory look at the breadth of the sort of things that I have on my skill set when it comes to what I've learned from my master's degree, as well as sort of doing science communication before that. But before we get into that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. And so as you all are aware, we're using Zoom, a platform. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of the sort of application window, you'll see option for a chat function. If you look at the chat function, Charles Billow has already made a or maybe you can't see that, but I've seen that someone has already said thank you for the presentation, which is great. If we could all take maybe a moment to, great, so someone sees it. Great, so I think there may be only an option for responding to all panelists versus all panelists and attendees. So if there is that differentiation, then you will be able to send messages towards everyone attending this webinar today, me and everyone else in attendance, or else if it's selected at all panelists, then and I'll only be able to see it. So we can chat individually and we can chat as a community. And so throughout the webinar, I'll be prompting you to have some conversations about different concepts when it comes to science communication, and we'll be using the chat function as a way to do so. So if you wanted to check it out, well, you wanted to, or if you wanted to be acquainted, we'll just take a moment to do that, and people are saying hi and thanking each other, so that's really great. And I think I'll probably move on. So as Katie has already said, I am a master's student in science communication. I'm actually done all of the requirements for my degree, and I technically just have to graduate and convocate. And I have a background in science as well. I've studied genetics and biochemistry, and I've also done a lot of performance artwork, and mainly in theater, especially in improvised theater over the past decade. And so I've always been sort of interested not only in understanding how the world works, so scientific inquiry and science and all of the cool things that come with it, but also storytelling and how storytelling relates to science. And science communication was obviously the perfect fit for that. So that's me, and we'll move on. So great, we're to the part where I'm gonna ask the audience, ask the attendees to contribute to the conversation. So I have a few questions that are gonna prompt you to give answers in the chat. The first one is this: what is science communication? It could be a long answer, a short answer, it could be a half-baked answer. There's no wrong answers. So if you wanted to share in the chat with selecting all panelists and attendees, then we can all see your answers for what science communication is. So any means of sharing science to the general public is one answer. Connecting with the target audience. Ooh, we're going fast. I'm hoping I can keep up. Sharing ideas and research. the process of communicating science-related matters in a way appropriate to the audience. Yeah, audience focus is a huge aspect of today's webinar, so that's great. Ooh, passion is a word that I saw come up. Catering to a non-science audience. Explaining science in a way that is easy for the audience to understand. So answering the question, so what? Cool, great. Oh, there's so many. It's a field of study too. We're going to be talking about that as well. Making the stories of science accessible. Great, so those are great answers. We're going to move on to question 2. Who does science communication? Teachers communicate science? Everyone communicates science, just some people suck at it. Scientists, everyone, not enough scientists. Great answers. Journalists, famous authors. One of my favorite pieces of science communication is a play written by Tom Stoppard, the same person that did Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. It's about entropy and chaos, and it's called Arcadia, and it's really, really good. So yeah, authors can for sure communicate science. People who care about science, everyone interested in the topic. Yeah, totally. Okay, question number 3. Why does it matter? Why do people do this thing? Why is it important? Why do I have a master's in the field? Why is there a research program across basically every continent that has science communication as its topic? Influencing policy, increasing knowledge and understanding, science is misunderstood, decisions need to be made on facts. We're at a point in time where a lot of people think reality is photoshoppable, because people need to understand science in order to make evidence-influenced decisions. Cool. Yeah, I think we still have one more question, so we'll move on to the last one. How can you communicate science? The more ways, the better. Through art, yeah. Art science is really something that I'm really passionate about. If you've heard of STEAM, that's the normal STEM acronym, when you add a art for it into it, and it becomes something with energy and direction, right? STEAM pushes engines and STEAM expands, and it's a nice way of making science expansive and more accessible. Policy briefs and position statements, videos, personally, writing, teaching, social media, events. Ooh, STEAM. STEAM is science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, with an added A, which is art. And so, yeah, basically taking STEM and adding a little bit of flair to it, a little bit of heat. And it, evaporates, it boils off into something with more energy. Right. Great. So I think we're going to be moving on now. We'll be discussing science communication, starting with like a little bit of an introduction and then getting more towards theory and then a little bit of perspective from my own opinion. So science communication, like many of you have said already, is really rooted in having a strong and democratic society centered around science and evidence-based decision-making. So making sure that every choice that we make is informed by evidence and the results of science. And this is important because an informed and engaged and enthusiastic public with a strong toolkit in science is better able to make decisions in our best interests and to fight against things like ideology and authoritarianism. We can hold people accountable, which is really important. Science communication isn't just an extracurricular activity either. It's not just something that is done in order to be eligible for a specific grant, a checkbox that needs to be ticked off. Many people actually base their entire careers on this field. I mean, I am an example of one of such people. People attend programs that are academic and specifically tailored to either training you in the skill set of communicating science, but even studying science communication. It's a field of academic study, and people do research on effective communication theories. And a lot of this work is published in journals like Science Communication and Public Understanding of Science. You could do a PhD studying how people communicate science, and that is all encompassed under the concept of science communication. So there's a lot of important reasons why we should be doing science communication. Firstly, like if your research is publicly funding, then you literally owe it to the public to communicate your science because they helped pay for it. And honestly, most of the time, the person who knows a specific piece of research best is the person that conducts it. You know your research better than anyone else most of the time. And so it just kind of makes sense that the people that are conducting the research would also be involved in the communication of it. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the scientist is being the communicator themselves, because we're a diverse group of people, and some people have certain things that they flourish at and certain skills that they have and others don't. But collaborating is a really great way of ensuring that science communication is done and done well and is done correctly and honestly and accurately. And honestly, I've also found that collaborative science communication pieces have been the most rewarding for me as an individual. And so, yeah, science communication doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person on screen or giving the talk. There's a lot of ways to contribute to science communication for people that maybe aren't inclined to those sorts of forward-facing positions. Good science communication also maintains science's social capital, which is really important because, like some of you have mentioned in the chat already, we are struggling against anti-science thoughts and campaigns. People tend to be right now having a lot of anti-elitist sentiment, and this sentiment can often turn anti-expert in subsections of society. And so, unfortunately, scientists and the institution of science may fall under that sort of umbrella of people trying to dissociate and unalign themselves with science. So science communication is a great way of maintaining science's social capital so that these things don't happen, so that science doesn't lose its importance and place in society. And we can do this by making science look intriguing, delightful, awesome, sometimes awful and terrifying, in that, oh gosh, black holes really are scary and so interesting sort of way. Not only that, but science communication is good for you too. You learn a lot of transferable skills that can be pushed to other aspects of your life. You can foster things like creativity, public speaking, spontaneity, and other pro-social skills. And yeah, it doesn't even have to fall into your academic or your career. It could also fall into your personal life, which is always really great. Being good communicators is always an important and good thing for humans. Many scientists claim that being a scientist helps them be a better science communicator, which makes sense for obvious reasons. If you are familiar with science, then you can be better equipped to communicate it. But a lot of science communicators I know have said that being a science communicator helps them be a better scientist, which is always really fascinating to me. So I'm just reading in the chat here. Charles just was talking about many people think reality can simply be declared, having no idea why science is the most valid. So how do we show and teach that? And great, I'm seeing that there's people interacting in the chat and conversing about this. People are great. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that while this conversation is going on, if you feel like you have thoughts, you can jump in at any time and advance that. Gonna probably move on with my next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science communicator as an individual. Who a science communicator is important, and studies have shown that there are specific qualities that a science communicator should have in order to do effective science communication. So science communication that sticks and actually has measurable outcomes in the audience. So yeah, who you are as a person does have an important role in the science that you're communicating. It's not dissociated from you, like you might think it might be if you think about, well, the science speaks for itself. You speak for yourself and you are speaking on behalf of the science. And so who you are does have a role to play in the effectiveness of your science communication. And so some traits that have been shown to be really important are being credible, organized, respectful, and audience focused. So credibility doesn't necessarily mean having a PhD or even being an established science communicator, but the science that's being communicated, your acts of science communication should be rooted in science, and that you should be referencing credible sources. Because really, if you sabotage your reputation, if you are drawing from uncredible sources, and if you are making things up, then of course nobody will take you seriously or believe you. Being organized also goes hand in hand with appearing credible. If you seem reliable and put together, then people are more inclined to take you seriously. Being respectful is a huge thing, especially in science communication. If you're condescending, then people will just tune you out. And it may not even be your intention to be condescending. It just may happen because not only can people be turned off by someone communicating science at too high of a technical level, using too much jargon, but also bringing things down and simplifying them too much can also seem condescending as well. And so it's all about finding the proper balance when it comes to just exactly how much you're assuming and how much you're giving your audience when it comes to their prior knowledge. And being audience focused, like the chat mentioned before, is really, really important. And I would argue that most of this presentation does center around the concept of audience-focused science communication. And I see the chat was still going on. Great, so I'm gonna be moving on now and talking about science a little bit more as a sort of institution and a process. Science has uncertainty. We like to think of it as this objective process, but there was always going to be some uncertainty associated with it because of the fact that science never really proves anything. It just presents the best possible explanation at that point for some phenomenon, but science really exists, and the scientific method really works by the fact that those claims can be further disproven by the scientific method. And so nothing is really ever truly objective in science. Things can be really supported by a lot of evidence, and that's great, but people can like attack, and we're very familiar with we're really familiar with claims from people that attack science about how things are just theories. It's tough because as much as we want to like say that something is for sure, scientists and the process of science is cautious. But I would like to argue that this sort of incomplete objectivity, this subjectivity within science, is really a good thing, especially when it comes to communicating science, because subjectivity allows us to be creative and persuasive and enticing and using splendor and delight and inspiring people in a way that, again, like saying that science can just speak for itself objectively cannot achieve. And this is how we reach out to people and get people interested, is through the subjectivity of science. It's through the experiences of individuals and how people relate to their work. I think that's really interesting. And so the main point of this slide is just that, like, don't discredit the purpose and the importance of subjectivity when it comes to communicating science, because it's often something that gives it strength. So over the years, there have been many different models used to explain and describe how science communication actually happens. And this kind of relates to what Charles is saying in the chat about optimized level of communication. There are different models, and studies have shown that different models are more effective than others. The first one we're going to be talking about is the transmission model, which is also known as the deficit model. And the transmission model sort of assumes a lack of knowledge or context at the audience's end that must be filled by the science communicator, as if though the audience was some sort of conduit or receptacle that was, filled with the knowledge from a jug like water or something. And I'm sure we've all experienced acts of science communication that would fit into the sort of transmission model framework. But as studies have shown, transmission doesn't work really well. It's ineffective, outdated, condescending. And it mainly is ineffective because it tries to treat all audiences as the same. It just assumes that every single person in the audience will be at the same level, the same backgrounds, all of these different things when it comes to considering who the audience is aren't really considered when we're talking about a transmission model form of science communication. And so it's not effective. People don't tend to recall or remember things as well when you are using transmission models of science communication. So what works better instead is sort of what I've called here dialogue. There's many different models in the literature. Ooh, so Jeff, sorry, just to interrupt for a second. Jeff Clark is saying that they're having audio trouble and Zoom crashing. Has this happened to anyone else before I move on? Just a message in the chat. Okay, everyone seems to be stable. Then I would say that maybe the best thing would be to turn off the app and then restart, or maybe it is just your internet, and so anyway, moving on. So open dialogue between the communicator and the audience. I've called this dialogue. There are different words for this and different subversions of this sort of approach to science communication in the literature, but basically you're considering who the audience is as if it was a diplomatic meeting rather than a lecture in a university class. So you consider who they are and their contexts and experiences when it comes to the approach that you're taking, and also considering your context and experiences and the knowledge that you have as the communicator, and changing things suited to what specific situations you might find yourself and your audience in. And so it considers information flowing one way from the communicator to the audience and the other way from the audience to the communicator. And so dialogue, and this is a much more effective form of science communication. And like I mentioned in the slide, it doesn't need to be a literal dialogue. Yeah, I mean, so great question. How are you supposed to not use a transmission model of science communication when you're posting about something or lecturing a class? I mean, for the class, it's all about getting to know your students and requesting that feedback, right? And asking what things are working and what aren't. Questions are always a great way to do that. For posting things, I mean, following up on comments is a great way of engaging people in a from what was a transmission model form of an act of science communication, it becomes more dialogue based just by interacting. I know it's not feasible for everyone to be monitoring their posts and the comments on posts, but that is one way. Another way is just to design posts or lectures that fit a specific audience form. And we're going to be talking about audience a lot more, and so we'll get into that. Okay, and I'm moving on. Right, so audience is crucial because who the audience is, really it informs the values, the demographics, political beliefs, cultures, interests, and passions that your communication has to be crafted for. And so different groups will be most effectively communicated at in different ways depending on these things. Right? If you aren't using the right language, then you're not going to be getting very far at all with your Science Communication Act. If you're not considering their political beliefs, then you may have people stop listening to you based on political issues rather than issues based solely in science. And so all of these things need to be considered when you are communicating and crafting acts of communication in order to be effective. And a great way to do this is by using specific framing. Because science communication is inherently persuasive, it requires strategy in order to be successful. And because we know that different people will require different strategies, we can use framing to really craft things for specific people and audiences. It's one of the best ways to ensure that your science communication sticks. It considers them, and it's great. A great example I always think of and that I learned in my master's is that if you were trying to convince people of the merit of green energy, if you're talking to environmentalists, then you can use the frame of climate change to do that. Green energy will reduce our carbon emissions, which decreases our contribution to climate change, and therefore we're mitigating it. That's a way to frame green energy for environmentalists. If you are trying to pitch green energy to, let's say, maybe libertarians or like members of the Republican Party, then instead of framing things within climate change, which you might have some resistance for, you could frame things more so in the context of energy independence. If we make Canada or the United States solely reliant on green energy that's made in the country, then we'll have energy independence and really, we'll have energy independence and we won't have to rely on anyone else. And so that really targets the value of protectionism and security when it comes to that audience. How far does framing go into being partisan? It really depends on, well, one, who you're talking to, and two, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in this example that I'm using right now, it's about making sure that people across partisan lines are listening to what you're trying to talk about, rather than specifically, because you're communicating about the science or the technology, you're trying to have them listen to you. And that's the first roadblock when it comes to these sorts of things, because as we'll get into further in the webinar, sometimes you will come up against people that just shut you out completely. And if you can't get to that, if you get to that point and then have people shut you out, then it doesn't really matter about it doesn't really matter what science communication you're doing, if that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. It's about targeting your audience, not slanting the actual content. Exactly. You could talk about green energy in the exact same way, but just from a different, this is how it benefits you versus this is how it benefits you sort of perspective. Yeah, and so, yeah, of course, no worries, Jacqueline. So we're going to be moving on. Yeah, science communication is persuasive, and it might feel weird sometimes to trying to be persuasive, but it is important when you're doing an act because that roadblock is really hard. So establishing goals is a great way of ensuring that your science communication hits its mark, that you are getting out of it what you want it to be getting out of it from the audience, and that they're taking away what you want to be taking away from the presentation or the post or whatever medium you might be using. So establishing clear goals is a great way of ensuring that your act hits. And great questions always are, what is important for them to understand and what is important for them to remember. And I like to think of this more so as the difference between understanding as the things that happen along the way, what are the moments along the journey that they'll experience and be along with you for, whereas if we're using this metaphor, for what's important to remember, it's when you get to the end of your journey, when you're at your destination, what will they take away from it? What's their take-home message, their after-school special tidbit of information that they'll leave your science communication act remembering? And so understanding is really about making sure that they're with you along the way, and remembering is about what happens once you're no longer communicating science to them. And so, as I was mentioning before, having a values-based, audience-focused science communication plan is important because we all have different values and beliefs and attitudes. And ultimately, this is kind of hard for us, for everyone, because humans are really tricky, we're defensive, and we like to protect our values mainly at all costs. And so our beliefs and attitudes and perceptions really become a filter to science communication. And this is the point at which you will mainly lose people, because if you are not communicating science in a way that considers their beliefs and values, they'll just stop listening to you because they don't want to experience cognitive dissonance where they have two competing thoughts in their head fighting it out. Because what will often happen is that they will always choose, not always, but they will often choose the thing that already exists there because it is, it's easier and it's safer. Rethinking your entire outlook on a specific aspect of life is scary and hard. And so context is super important for science communication. Really, like if you approach a group of people that have only ever used zippers before and you compare something to Velcro and they have no idea what that is, it won't be effective. That's a really simplified example of it, but this can exist in so many different ways when it comes to our beliefs and knowledge and ideas and perceptions. Because we'll always be cross-referencing what's being communicated to us with either what we know or what we think we know. And so this is the point at which people will shut you out if things start conflicting too much with their own worldviews. And so having prior knowledge about your audiences will ensure that they will be engaged when you're communicating science to them. That's mainly the gist of it. So I'm going to be moving on a little bit now from audiences and values to specifically more communicating science, the act of it itself. And so we'll be talking about words right now. And it may seem pedantic, but the words that we use in science communication possess tremendous weight and meaning. They should be deliberate, have a specific purpose, and be intended for a specific audience. We all know that jargon is a huge barrier when it comes to audiences. And I mean, here's a good example of how that can be. I threw this together an integral transporter protein with a hydrophobic aliphatic core placed within the semi-permeable phospholipid bilayers of the nucleus and member of the nuclear pore complex of eukaryotic cells is something that maybe 1% of you are like really excited about, but the rest of you, you know, it's jargon. It is what it is. And jargon is great in a lot of contexts when it comes to doing science because it decreases ambiguity, you're more specific, and it helps researchers communicate with each other really, really well. The problem is that often it increases ambiguity in the public. Words have different meanings colloquially versus academic or scientifically, and a lot of people just haven't heard of a lot of jargon. And so it may be hard to understand science communication if it's very jargon heavy. So if you can, don't use it, but if you can't, try to define it. I've also included 2 links here on this slide about really cool sort of jargon-related science communication resources. The first link, scienceandpublic.com, is a form that you can fill out with science communication text, and it will analyze the percentage of jargon that's being used in your text. And the second, which I think is still in development, out of a group based in Kingston, theoryjar.com, they're trying to develop a translator for jargon. So something that works basically just like Google Translate, except it translates scientific jargon into language that's more acceptable for broad audiences. With words, we can also talk about metaphors. I highly recommend always using metaphors when you're communicating science because science is already rich with metaphors anyway. And you might not realize it, but scientists use metaphors to describe basically anything. We can talk about, I'll pose this question for the audience right now. When I say the word mitochondria, what do you all think of? Powerhouse of the cell, energy, right? Powerhouse, energy tank. High school, yeah, of course. You learned this all in high school, right? Meme, yeah, it's a great science meme too. But it's not a literal powerhouse. It just serves the same function as a powerhouse. The same thing, Lynn Margulis, great. Yeah, Lynn Margulis is great. Food webs aren't literal webs of predator and prey species in an ecosystem. There's no actual web that exists. And greenhouse effect, right? Although a lot of people may not be familiar with greenhouses, it works in a way that describes the process of global warming. A lot of people have been switching towards using a metaphor of a blanket rather than a greenhouse because I guess a lot of science communicators felt that people weren't familiar enough with greenhouses. But again, a blanket of carbon dioxide that wraps around the earth and warms it. So metaphors already exist in science, and they should be used in science communication because it's inherent to the field. Metaphors are great, and they're really fun to come up with too. I think that coming up with a great metaphor might be one of the most fun things to do in science communication. So when it comes to doing science communication itself, I like to think that you can do science communication basically anytime, as long as you're nice about it, as long as you have the consent from your audience that now is an appropriate time to be doing science communication to them. So making sure that if you're gonna start, espousing the greatness of Lynn Margulis in the middle of a party, that everyone's on board with having this sort of tangent happen. So picking up on verbal cues is important. If you're going to be doing science communication on the fly, then you'll definitely have to consider audiences with less preparation work. But I wanted to ask the group sort of where and when and how can science communication happen So what are some of the medium forms, or what are some of the situations or environments in which you would communicate science? It could be professionally or casually. What do you think is the sort of situation in which science communication happens? And if you've communicated science in a really interesting or peculiar way, I'd love to hear about it too in the chat. So social media, schools, media events, when asked as an expert by the media. Yeah, conversations with friends. I read this headline about a new study. Is that true? Church, I believe that for sure. Church is really great. Religion is really great at establishing communities and people that talk to each other on a regular basis and have familiarity. So talking about science and science communication happening in church totally makes sense to me. Media reports, podcasts, medical professionals to patients, hopefully video, places where attendees don't expect it, music festivals. Oh, I would love to communicate science at music festivals. Concerts I've definitely done a lot of. Yeah, so these are all really great answers. I think that like one of the most rewarding things about being a science communicator is that you're kind of always a science communicator. When you're a scientist, you're always kind of a science communicator. When you have a career that is based in or around science, you're always going to do science communication to a certain extent because people trust scientists. People trust scientists more than they trust other professions like journalists and politicians. And for a lot of people, you may be the personal science communicator for them. I have a lot of friends that will come to me for specifically science communication questions just because of my science and science communication background. I've been asked things about clouds and snakes and a bunch of sort of different fields of science that I don't necessarily have the background in, but that they trust me enough to provide to them accurate information and communication that's respectful and values them as an individual who is curious and asking these sorts of questions. And I think that these small, seemingly insignificant acts of science communication are some of the most important because they really help shape the way your loved ones interact with science and your career as someone who is interested or works in science. And so if you can frame people's relationship with science through these acts in a positive way, especially people that are close to you and that are your loved ones, I think that is the most important if we want to talk about maintaining science's social capital and ensuring that people still respect the field and respect the people that are doing it. And yeah, definitely science and scientists aren't respected as they once were, but recent studies have definitely shown the numbers are a lot better for scientists than they are for like the fields I mentioned before, journalists and politicians in particular. In the chat, there are some other good questions. How are you sure that your boss in instructing you to communicate is working to bring out or suppress the truth? I mean, I think that is all about having the sort of skepticism in everyone, right? Skepticism is really inherent in. I have this in 15 minutes. Thank you. And having the skepticism of science in the act of science communication itself is important, and having that skepticism is always great. So just moving on. So before we end with some questions, I'm just going to go over a little bit of a cursory review of some of the things that you've mentioned already when it comes to how you can communicate science. I would say that some of these ways of communicating science have larger barriers than other ones, but I think that it's important to note that the biggest barrier when it comes to communicating science, and this is definitely the thing for a lot of people is actually just starting itself. Because of the many ways of doing science communication, probably the ideas that you have, the wealth of ideas, the many different things you want to do. Often, like, the thing that is hardest to do is just starting a project, getting down, making that first step. And so I just want to, like, encourage you all to just do it, not think about failure, not think about how good it's going to be at first, because I can think of so many different projects that I've never done because I was afraid of failing. And so communicating science just starts with starting, and that first step is huge. So a great way of communicating science is social media. Twitter and Instagram are really great platforms for communicating science on social media. This is Samantha Yarmie. If you haven't seen her science communication on both platforms, it's really great. And the different platforms of social media really are suited to different kinds of science communication. So, for example, if you're quick-minded and witty and communicate with brevity, Twitter is a great option for you, especially if you like debating people, particularly strangers who have eggs for heads. But if you're more of a visual communicator and a visual learner, then Instagram is a great platform, and it has a growing science communication community every single day. Moving on, podcasts are my favorite media form, not just for science communication, but all media forms. I love podcasts. And honestly, I know people that have podcasts that don't have the fanciest equipment. The main thing for them is that they just do it and they share their ideas and they started a feed. And so if a huge barrier for you is technical, monetary sort of barriers when it comes to making videos or podcasts, it's honestly not as important as having good ideas. And I've just mentioned a few of my favorite science podcasts here. So Gastropod is about the science and history of food. Ologies is a comedy science communication podcast where different scientists with ologist careers are interviewed, and Radiolab is obviously the most famous science podcast, if not one of the most famous podcasts. If you don't want to invest in equipment either, you can always volunteer at your local campus or community radio station to either host live shows or record episodes with their equipment as a volunteer. Like with audio, videos, the same way. You don't need the fanciest camera or the nicest equipment as long as you have great ideas, have new and novel approaches for communicating science. Some of the ones I've included here are classics like Braincraft and Minute Physics. They've been doing science communication on YouTube for a long time, and people really like science communication videos on YouTube. I find that it's probably one of the best platforms for a lot of ASAP Science is a great Canadian one for sure. Yeah, they do really good stuff, and they have a really broad reach. And so, I mean, new science or YouTube channels are popping up all the time, and honestly, again, the biggest barrier is just starting. I got my start in communicating science through writing, and it's definitely one of the classic science communication disciplines. People have been writing about science for as long as people have been doing science. I mean, writing journal articles is, in a way, writing science communication. And there are many options for you, especially here in Canada, for writing about science. If you haven't written before, one is The Conversation, which is a sort of journalistic news website where academics partner with journalists to produce pieces, op-eds, that sort of thing. Another in Canada is Science Borealis, a blog where you can contribute as a contributing writer to Science Borealis and write about science in every field imaginable. You could also write op-eds for your local news outlets if your research has particular policy implications, and if you need help with that, Evidence for Democracy is always willing and happy to help you in the op-ed writing process for science that has real political results. So live programming is another great way in Canada of doing science communication. There are many different people or groups, organizations you can do live programming with. Science Rendezvous happens every May on the Saturday before Mother's Day. It's a great festival of celebrating science. Science Literacy Week, started by Jesse Hildebrandt, is every September, so that's coming up, and they do events across Canada. Pint of Science is science communication, live programming in partnership with different bars and places where people gather to drink. And there are science slams hosted by Lit Science that happen across the country. And someone mentioned Story Collider. They definitely do live storytelling, science storytelling, and I think Toronto and Vancouver, there are both communities for Story Collider. I would love to see Story Collider expand across Canada. Story Collider also is accessible as a podcast, and they do live programming mainly at the Caveat in New York City. So if you're ever in New York and you want to see great live science communication programming, check out the Caveat because they have a lot of great programming. And there's so many more, and I only mentioned a few, and I know that we only have about 10 more minutes left. There are so many that could be mentioned, but we will have time for discussion, and we could talk about that or anything else that you have questions about as I move on. Here are just some resources that I've personally used in my sort of science communication hodgepodge, mishmash career. The Science Writer's Handbook was a great resource for me when it came to writing. Science blogging is another popular resource when it comes to making science accessible on the internet. If you want to join an association, the Science Writers and Communicators of Canada is a great resource, and they do conferences every year. The Open Notebook and Last Word on Nothing are two websites that are run by science communicators and science journalists that talk about the insides of the different mediums that they use and the different approaches that they have. And I've mentioned The Conversation and Science Borealis already. And of course, you can always read academic articles from science communication and the public understanding of science, because that's peer-reviewed research, and that's really great. So I'm going to thank everyone for sticking through for the entire presentation. We covered a lot today, and I tried to make this as much of an introductory class as possible, but I'm sure that you have questions, and so we can take some time to answer questions right now in the chat, but you can also reach me at this email, info@evidencefordemocracy.ca, and on Twitter at my handle, which is just my first and last name. And if I can't answer your questions, which might be likely, then I'll definitely try my best to point you in the direction of a resource or a person that might be better suited and capable of answering your questions. And Katie's also with me again, and she can also help answer questions if they're maybe more specific to science policy and evidence-based decision-making. So if there are questions, you can ask them in the chat now. Thanks for the webinar. What kinds of science communication experiences and types have you explored? So I've mainly done writing, but I've also, for example, curated art piece of people's, it was called Significant Figures, and it was an art piece of photographs of different scientists' lab notebooks, particularly like the most interesting page spreads of their notebooks. One of my favorite ones was my former organic chemistry professor who recently passed away, had a page from the 90s where there was organic chemistry reaction on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side was a big X through the mechanism, and then just a question of what went wrong. And so I love the idea of using art to communicate science. I've also been involved with videos that go beyond the sort of normal talking heads. My partner had animated with chalk for her very first time doing chalk animation or stop motion animation, a great companionship piece to an interview with one of my best friends who's a mathematical epidemiologist, and I'm really proud of that piece. So those are just some of the things. I've been involved in live programming too when it comes to Science Rendezvous. It's always fun making pools of oobleck to help kids run across and explain non-Newtonian fluids too. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah, that's a really great question. So the difference between approaching science communication with an agenda of changing people's minds, selling science to them, versus allowing the science to just speak for itself and encouraging the audience to form their own conclusions. Yeah, I mean, I think this really is related to where your audience is at. Having the more formal approach, trying to sell science, I think is more important and effective when there is resistance. But when you're working with a sort of willing audience, then the latter approach is definitely more effective. And actually, there's research that shows that the most effective science communication is constructivist, where people take away whatever it is that they take away from the act. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the science or what your goals are, but that will be most remembered and most effective when it comes to like having a memorable and positive experience in the audience. Yeah, it's tough striking that balance. I actually don't know who Ken Ham is. Do you, Katie? I'm assuming that this is probably a creationist or climate change denier who Bill Nye debated. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that I really dislike this concept of science being at odds with religion at times. And I think when it comes to creationists, it's really about thinking about the values that they're holding when it comes to the reason why they're being unresponsive or unreceptive, right? I there's a lot to talk about with that, and I don't know if I can really get into it. Do you want to? Sure.
Katie here. I mean, one thing that I find really interesting is particularly with people like that, or people in general who hold these very, very strong beliefs that are, you know, very clearly not in line with the science. The best way to think about it is that you're not really trying to target them. You're not going to change their mind. And so I think of it more in terms of like the people who are watching the debate. So it can still be really valuable to call these people out in whatever medium you're seeing them, whether it's on Facebook and people are sharing their posts, or on Twitter. It can still be valuable to call them out and counteract what they're saying, but with the mind that it's not about actually trying to change that person's mind. It's about these discussions that we're having in a public sphere, and it's about the people who are viewing this conversation and trying to show them that there is another side to the story and that what they're pushing isn't in line with the evidence. And so I find thinking about it that way is really helpful.
Great, thanks, Katie. Time is running out, and I do know that there's another person that needs the room very soon, but I'll try to touch on the other questions while we have a chance. Any resources for understanding what the general public knows? Yeah, I mean, I think that if I had more time, I would get into this, but the knowledge that the general public has isn't also necessarily, most importantly, scientific knowledge. If you want to use metaphors, then it's really about the whole entirety of their knowledge. And I mean, I don't really, if you have some demographic information about your audience, you can make assumptions, but sometimes the best assumption is either everything or nothing. It's really hard to say. So that's really all we have time for today. I'll also make this slide deck available somehow. And this presentation was also recorded, so it'll be going online as well to reference again later on. So thanks for your time. And we will also email the recording out to everybody as well. Thank you.